Jimmy Page is a living tribute to Led Zeppelin in the eyes of fans. But there's something about him that you probably didn't know. The world of music is holy to him, and he will not forgive anyone who damage it. The punishment for being caught listening to 60s music was essentially a jail sentence. He said nothing critical for nearly 50 years. Except for each name and message that he thought was bogus, he recalled them all. He has finally decided to share them, at the age of 81. There were 6 guitarists that made him want to just leave the studio in a huff. Despair, treachery, and narcissism. As you've never seen him before, this is Jimmy Page. Clapton, Eric. The fact that Jimmy Page despises Eric Clapton has never been an issue for him. He would go completely expressionless at the mere mention of that name in an interview, causing everyone in the room to fall silent. Instead of envy, he felt a deep-seated, merciless disdain, like a healed gash under the surface of British rock. A prophet, Clapton was proclaimed. Clapton is a deity. It was scrawled on walls, printed it out on notebook covers, drew it in the restroom. Plus, Page, the only thing he did was smirk and drop a dry-cutting phrase. I would like to engage in mental pursuits rather than show my emotions if that is indeed God's will. He thought Clapton was little more than a blues musician who, right up until his death, had 3 simple licks. Page was only using the public's adulation for his genuineness as a cover for his own sloth. Then there was the moment in 1965 in the studio when someone brought up Clapton. He fired a knife-edge glare and said curtly, without raising his voice, "He's got 3 blues licks in his pocket, and he'll ride them until the day he dies." That was not an evaluation. It constituted a phrase. With a dismissive shrug, the media was too cowardly to scrap Clapton, as if it were a defective draft. When Page intended to utilize drummer Jim Gordon for his solo project, things escalated when Clapton secretly recruited Gordon for his own band. This wasn't only stealing in Page's eyes. It was an act of deceit disguised as professionalism. Additionally, Eric stated in an interview that he relied on the generosity of other guys to build his profession. It's his specialty to show up late and claim credit for something that was mostly completed. Everyone could tell it wasn't about any animosity between them. A declaration it was. When others fall from grace, Clapton is only too happy to lift them up. As was his custom, Clapton said nothing. However, Page became obsessed with the total lack of sound. That wasn't noble serenity, in his view. It was the calculated coldness of someone who knew he was out of arguments but wanted to give the impression that he was still standing firm. And Page's ire was stoked by Clapton's continued silence, as he was well aware. That's how a feeble man acts. Page dove headfirst into intricate musical architecture, transforming each riff into a temple, until Led Zeppelin ascended like a sonic storm, trembling an entire generation. Clapton, meanwhile, retreated into heroin and drowsy ballads. Someone created everlasting musical structures. On his guitar, the other one penned an apology for his own withdrawal. Plus, when Clapton offhandedly said, "Page, I like things that are a bit more real," a slap encased in silk, that was it. Despite its outward gentleness, the comment was poisonous. Led Zeppelin was an illusion, not authentic. Without feeling, Page remained calm and collected. Waiting was all he did. Then, at a party in Notting Hill when someone carelessly mentioned Clapton, he raised his glass, eyes fixed on it as if the world no longer existed, and said coldly, "I don't play background for anyone." A statement that landed like a nail into stone. Page stood behind no one, especially not someone like Clapton. In 1983, when the Arms concert was organized to raise funds for charity, the organizers envisioned a duet between 2 guitar legends. Clapton agreed. Page, he declined. No explanation. No sign of softening. As if by fate, they never shared a stage. No handshake, no reconciliation. Only a void, cold as ice, deliberately constructed through intentional disregard. At events honoring Clapton, Page was always absent. No congratulatory letters, no tribute videos. For him, absence was a declaration. It wasn't a refusal, it was a silent verdict. I don't attend the funeral of something I never acknowledged as alive. Their fans split into 2 camps like opposing sections. One believed in raw pain, the other in intellectual permanence. But in between, remained silent, his silence sharp, echoing like a voice from the abyss. Until 2010, when a bold French journalist asked directly, "After all this, what do you think of Clapton?" Page didn't frown, didn't scowl. He just sipped his tea and dropped a line that was calm but cruel. Clapton is probably the best guitarist, among those who never dared to take risks. And before anyone could react, he added, "Me? I don't play safe." When asked if there was anything about Clapton he respected, Page shrugged, indifferent, as if talking about an outdated vinyl record. He's always stayed true to himself. No growth, no change. Sometimes that's a kind of courage, a compliment that seemed sincere but tasted bitter. Because everyone understood. Remaining the same forever is also a way to die standing still. This war has no end. No bloodshed. No proclamations. Only distance. Every time Page is absent from a Clapton event, every freezing glance, every brutally honest comment disguised as observation, all of it forms a quiet crack running through guitar history. Two men, two playing styles, two philosophies, never in sync, never side by side, and certainly never shaking hands. Because in Jimmy Page's eyes, true brilliance cannot come from a guitar that only repeats what's easy to hear. And it certainly cannot come from a god too afraid to step outside his own church. Keith Richards. If you believe that two icons like Jimmy Page and Keith Richards would naturally respect each other, prepare for that belief to be shattered. Between them lies a silent war spanning half a century. No brawls, no public scandals, just cold stares, sharp-tongued jabs, and symbolic indifference. Page once said, "Some people play music to tell stories, while others just strum 3 chords and call it art." He didn't name Richards, but everyone knew he was referring to the man he saw as the embodiment of sloppiness and arrogance. Meanwhile, Richards didn't hold back either. He once sneered that Led Zeppelin, despite Page's flashy leadership, lacked soul, just stylized noise tailored for the market. He told Rolling Stone plainly, "Jimmy is a talented guitarist, but I always felt there was something a bit hollow in their music, especially with John Bonham sounding like an out-of-control 18-wheeler." The 1975 Madison Square Garden event added fuel to their long-burning animosity, though you'd think the insults would stop there. With a drink of scotch glistening in the light, Page courteously extended his hand that night. "Not a crook deserves a handshake," Richards smiled and yelled. It was as if time stood still in the room. With everyone staring at the two performers, silence descended, and Page felt more than just insulted from that point on. As he stood before the Rolling Stones' emotional core, he realized that his career was in jeopardy. Page said nothing in response, but the expression on Richards' face stayed with him. Page would later confess that he admired Richards' natural timing and riffing abilities, which contributed to Richards' magnetic stage persona. However, Page did not mince words. Both musically and ideologically, they existed in parallel worlds. Richards began firing at Zeppelin anytime the chance presented itself after that. He made the scathing comparison that Led Zeppelin was a manufactured band that emerged at the perfect moment to fill a gap in the market. He said they were little more than empty shells, motivated solely by show and impact. Neither did Page remain silent. Anyone could play a few chords at random and consider it satisfying, he claimed in a useful 1977 interview with NME. It took imagination, a step beyond mechanical repetition, to create genuine music. Additionally, he was quite dismissive of the Stones when questioned about them. All it takes is 3 chords, a riff, and a critical stance that suggests Richards and the Stones were content to remain stagnant rather than evolve. Cold stares escaped Richards' lips in response. While Zeppelin was certainly capable of cranking up the volume, they failed to capture the essence of what makes their music so compelling. The gritty, classic rock sound that permeates every note. They have the language to construct rocket engines, but the ability to compose heartfelt music is a lost art. Any compliments for the lavish presentation were abruptly cut off by Richards. Never in their lives have these two men shared a stage. Backstage areas, mutual friends, and music nights have all brought them together, though they never strolled hand in hand. It seems like they needed more than just a drummer to keep the music from collapsing after Zeppelin dissolved following Bonham's death, Richards' sole ally. An offhand comment that came out as empathetic and casual, yet sliced through Zeppelin's legacy like a knife. "What are your thoughts on Clapton?" A French journalist finally mustered up the courage to ask Page. "Excuse me, I meant Zeppelin." No scowl crossed Page's face. As he leisurely sipped his tea, he stated, "Keith Richards might be one of the best guitarists I've ever known. However, he lamented that Zeppelin occasionally lose their essence due to their excessive volume and relentless touring." He went on to say that Jimmy Page is just Jimmy if you were to ask, standing alone, without Richards as a basis and without a desire for an alliance. Page made a pronouncement that didn't require aggression to express itself. Silently incompatible for 50 years, their animosity became legendary, yet it was never out in the open. Page, who takes risks and strives for excellence, is an expert at overdubs and mic placement. Richards, the unfiltered spirit, playing old riffs while smoking and oblivious to the studio clock. Incompatible but complementary, these two British rock extremes are rewriting rock history with each breath. During Jimmy Page's tenure, while Led Zeppelin established themselves as the undisputed symbol of British rock in the late 1980s, another meteoric rise occurred. Yngwie Malmsteen. The Swedish guitarist stole the show with an almost supernatural air of confidence, thanks to his vertiginous skill and classical scale flair. Not long after that, he attacked Page's legacy in addition to claiming to be the best. The color blue doesn't interest me. I prefer not to tone it down and pass it off as feeling. I don't hear guitar playing there. That's just laziness. Though he didn't name names, Page and anyone who cherished the subtleties of blues knew exactly who he was talking about. Page never responded. He didn't need to. But according to those who worked closely with him, he turned pale with rage. Not because a 20-something had insulted his music, but because that young man had insulted everything Page believed in. Feel over flash, soul over speed. Malmsteen was once asked about his influences. When Jimmy Page was listed among 10 guitarists he admired, he replied bluntly, "I respect Led Zeppelin, but as a guitarist, too sloppy for me. I prefer Paganini over Pentatonics." A surgical strike intended to recast Page as a relic of the past decade. At Abbey Road Studios, an engineer recalled, Page raised an eyebrow at the mention of Malmsteen's name, then muttered, "If you play 3,000 notes and none of them mean anything, what's the point?" A rhetorical question, as if to say, if technique doesn't convey feeling, what value does it hold? Others remembered Page remarking, "It's like watching someone juggle chainsaws. Impressive? Maybe. Music? Nowhere to go." His aesthetic sensibility collapsed in the face of a cold mechanical performance. In 1991, at a London charity function, the most memorable thing happened. There were two men, and neither of them knew the other was there. Wearing a velvet suit and sunglasses, Yngwie made his way indoors to the green room. Page spun around and let out a low breath. Thank goodness. A Strat is played by Dracula. Yngwie turned around, grinned, and spoke a line that would go down in history just seconds afterward. The vampire Dracula does his best. All sound faded from the room. Amateur guitarists who dabbled in the instrument got to see a covert conflict unfold in front of their eyes. Page, recalling a roadie, clenched his jaw and stormed off. The air was thick with anxiety, but there was no commotion or yelling. Malmsteen then proceeded to continue hurling darts at the screen. "These so-called classical pioneers are out of date," he said frankly in interviews. "What they know is what they play. I focus on the attainable." Page did not say a word, so the conventional guitar players had to speak out. Joe Satriani and Brian May both said that Malmsteen was technically gifted but emotionally deficient. Time went by. Never worked together, never shared a stage, never spoke to each other face to face. The two men lived in separate worlds. A question on the modern musician's fixation with speed prompted Page to stop before responding. "Some people are very fast, but you can't play emotion at 200 BPM during the 2008 Led Zeppelin reunion campaign." After that, he gave a subtle grin, as if to confirm that he was aware of the difference between speed and soul. That wrath lingered. A gulf existed in Malmsteen's remarks, despite the fact that he had previously mentioned Page as one of the guitarists he admired. "I admire Page because he had a vision beyond his role as a guitarist." The entire piece was crystal clear to him. Still, Malmsteen never identified with the Page school of thinking, despite his technical flourishes and lack of vulnerability. Editors, radio hosts, and guitar critics all agreed. This was more than just a collision of genres. It was a complete schism between technical prowess and emotional depth. If sonic cathedrals are designed by Page, then Malmsteen is the man who sprints barefoot across razor wire, according to one admirer. Disagreement arose not just between the two artists, but also between their respective ideologies. They would never perform together since one built castles and the other set off pyrotechnics. I am Jimi Hendrix. The whole city of London appeared to go into a deep freeze as Jimi Hendrix took the stage for the first time in 1967. Someone from the United States who had a blazing afro, a Fender guitar that was upside down, and a sound that no one had ever heard before. Stunned, the crowd went wild. A few of them cheered nonstop. One man, however, stood motionless in a dark corner of the stage, his piercing eyes peering through the smoke of his cigarettes. Absence of cheers, silence. The guy in question embodied Jimmy Page. A thin layer of ice, trembling with tension, separated them. They were never friends and were never openly antagonistic. As Hendrix twisted the rules, Page rewrote them in black ink, consumed by fixation, while the other painstakingly constructed sound walls resembling a labyrinth. During that time, London was under extreme stress. Which one was faster and more skilled? Greater impact on global affairs. Artists felt these things in each other through whispers behind the scenes. The press had no business deciding on them. According to a long-lost acquaintance of Page's, the musician who had been playing guitar before the arrival of this American musician was immediately forgotten when he showed up at a late-night tea. Though it was a delicate statement, each syllable was sharp. In public, Jimmy Page rarely brought up Hendrix. That wasn't necessary. A disturbing picture was painted from quotes that had fallen into disarray over time. In an interview he gave in 1969, he mentioned that some people believe shattering guitars makes you a genius. True artists can get by without pyrotechnics. Anonymous, please. The target's identity was widely known. The goal of Page's music was never to set the stage ablaze. The focus was on architecture, ritual, and complete command. Page baptized chaos what Hendrix referred to as emotion. Where Hendrix tinkered with flames, I beheld but a fleeting silhouette. It went beyond mere disagreement. A philosophical conflict erupted. While one revered immaculate detail, even down to the mic placement, the other had a faith in unfiltered magic. Words spread like wildfire from the subdued tension. According to a sound engineer who worked at an Olympic Studios event, Page walked off stage after saying just one syllable as Hendrix's Voodoo Child played over the speakers. Desaturation without purpose. Quiet judgment. No fury, no eruption. It was Hendrix who was unique. He spoke about Jimmy Page with cool dignity in interviews. Even Led Zeppelin was once his target. However, whether he felt the coldness emanating from beyond the border remained a mystery. Maybe it wasn't the case. Maybe Hendrix just didn't give a damn. Next year, in 1970, Jimi Hendrix passed away. Out of the blue, lightning struck during the night. Artists and reviewers were quick to crown Page the guitar saint and say he changed music forever, but Page remained silent. There was not a single public remark, tribute piece, or expression of sympathy. It was a one-of-a-kind moment in time, he said when asked, simply, about Hendrix's legacy. It was hard to tell if the sentence was praising or dismissing because of how empty it was. Slipped silently into second position when the rankings started identifying Hendrix as the best guitarist of all time. That would be a privilege for some. Perhaps it was a harsh reminder to Page that the world's god had already been selected, and he hadn't been picked. Whoever was envious didn't stem from a lack of skill on the field. The idea originated with those who would live on in mythology before they grew old. He swept into the annals of time like a tempest, while the other persisted in constructing his oral temple. Maybe it wasn't Hendrix's sound that troubled Page, but rather the way he made everyone tune out everything else. That Jimmy Page hates Hendrix is something I doubt he ever uttered. However, his every smirk, subtle jab, and time he left the stage to the sound of Hendrix's music conveyed his message. Maybe this is how geniuses declare war in their world. By means of sound, by means of stillness, and by means of unwavering pride. Van Halen was Eddie. Eddie Van Halen was a phenomenon when he burst into the rock scene in the late 1970s. However, Jimmy Page perceived danger. Eddie was hailed as a trailblazer by the world for his revolutionary work on the electric guitar. His exhilarating speed, lightning-fast tapping, and groundbreaking solos like Eruption caused a whole generation to take a second look at their lives. That wasn't evolution, though, in Jimmy Page's view. That was treachery. Page and a handful of session musicians met at a London pub late one night in 1978 to listen to a new cassette tape that had just arrived from California. Someone made the comment, "This kid's got something," as the first tapping part began to play. In silence, Page drew a drag from his cigarette and, like a subsurface tectonic upheaval, quietly emitted a sentence. Parlor tricks are easy for anyone to learn. True guitar playing is an expression of emotion rather than a performance art. Word of the quote quickly spread, and getting to Eddie was a breeze. Eddie later said in an interview that Jimmy Page was an inspiration and that he got into the wild stuff because of him. Humbly, without a trace of animosity, he grinned. However, Page appeared even more infuriated by that serenity. This was due to Eddie's rule-breaking rather than his rudeness. The blues were an integral part of Page's upbringing. With each chord he played, he left an indelible mark, a curse born of anguish. His sound was rich, sluggish, and eerie, like a ritual. But Eddie was carefree and full of excitement, like a child playing with lightning. He seemed to never make a mistake, but he also never hurt himself. Playing the guitar and playing with a guitar are two different things. Even though Page omitted the name Eddie in his 1979 conversation with a backstage interviewer, the industry was aware of who he meant. It happened more than once. Innocently testing the speakers at a 1980s Los Angeles recording session, a young technician played a sample of Eruption. In the midst of reviewing a demo tape, Page abruptly jumped up, extinguished his cigarette, and declared, "I've heard enough bedroom noodling for one lifetime." There was silence. The phone went dead. For the remainder of the day, nobody sang that tune again. Page did not view Eddie as an adversary. Eddie personified a future he refused to face. Imagine a world where art might exist without the need for profundity, mystery, or pain, just rapidity and showmanship. Page could not forgive since the Led Zeppelin empire had been painstakingly established on emotion and mystery. Eddie's fast, he once told a sound engineer at Abbey Road. What remains, however, when the effects, the speed, and the flash are removed? A rhetorical question. A verdict. What's remarkable is that Eddie never fought back. He continued to call Page a master, continued to cite Led Zeppelin as an influence in interviews. But perhaps that humility only made Page feel even more displaced. Eddie didn't need to fight. He didn't need to compete. He simply surpassed. A guitarist who had watched both perform once said, Page played with ghosts. Eddie played like he was trying to outrun them. And that's the heart of it. While Page clung to shadows, mystery, and sounds dragged from the abyss, Eddie raced into the light with a grin and a speed no one could catch. In a fair world, they might have coexisted. But in Jimmy Page's heart, there was no room for two kings. And Eddie Van Halen, without meaning to, without declaring war, took the throne. In the eyes of the public, in the hearts of a younger generation, and in the deepest, most unspoken fear of a legend being replaced. When Eddie died in 2020, the world mourned. Jimmy Page posted a simple tribute. No flourishes, no bitterness, just a short paragraph about the legacy Eddie left behind for guitar. But those who had heard Page speak in the shadows, who had seen him leave the room when Van Halen came on, knew that tribute did not come from the heart. Perhaps Page never truly hated Eddie. He only hated what Eddie represented, a generation he couldn't control, couldn't decode, and no longer belonged to. Ritchie Blackmore in the blazing fire of the 1970s, when the guitar was a weapon and its players the knights of rock. Two names constantly avoided each other like the same poles of a magnet, Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore. Both were masters, architects of sound who carved their names into history. But between them, there was never respect, only caution, contempt, and a feud that neither dared to name. It all began in the least hostile of places, the studio. Both Page and Blackmore were session musicians in their early careers. They knew of each other. They had met. And according to a technician at Olympic Studios, from the first moment they locked eyes, not a single word was spoken. But the look Page gave was like someone had walked in with a guitar that hadn't been tuned. Not long after, the whispers began. When Page heard a demo of Blackmore's early Deep Purple Mechai recordings, he allegedly told a colleague coldly, Blackmore thinks every song needs a bloody sword fight, a scathing jab, not only mocking Ritchie's aggressive playing style, but also ridiculing his theatrical battle-ready persona. To Page, who believed every sound should be precise, ritualistic, what Blackmore brought to the table was nothing more than drama, and Page didn't play with drama. That contempt only deepened as Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple rose in parallel. While Page immersed himself in intricate compositions like Kashmir and Achilles' Last Stand, Blackmore veered the other way, leaner, louder, and sometimes, as Page once put it, Renaissance fair nonsense. A German magazine in 1975 quoted Page saying, "There are guitarists who serve the song, and there are guitarists who make the song serve them." No names were mentioned, but none were needed. Everyone in the business knew it was aimed at Ritchie, the man who routinely hijacked the spotlight with 10-minute solos on stage, as if testing the audience's patience was part of the act. That attitude reached its breaking point during a backstage encounter in London in 1974. Blackmore arrived late to a soundcheck for a charity concert. Page, already present, stood up the moment Ritchie entered. No greeting, no handshake, just a turn to his assistant and a cutting sentence. "I don't have time for costume parties." That phrase became legend in British rock circles. Costume party. Not just a dig at Blackmore's stage attire, but a complete dismissal of his artistic identity. To Page, Ritchie wasn't a musician. He was a court jester in medieval armor. As for Ritchie Blackmore, he seemed unfazed. In interviews, he repeatedly praised Page as a very clever recording technician. Some believed he meant it sincerely. Others suspected Ritchie was playing a reverse chess game. The less you react, the more it drives your opponent mad. But Page didn't need insults to feed his resentment. He remembered every word, every gesture. A close friend once said, Jimmy believed Ritchie had no soul, just speed, just drama. And in Jimmy Page's world, lacking soul was an unforgivable sin. Not everyone noticed the tension. There were no fights, no public arguments. But every time Page was asked about Deep Purple, he responded with cold silence. Even when Led Zeppelin was compared to them, a common habit of the press, he'd only smirk, sometimes adding a vague remark, "They're loud." Later, When Blackmore formed Rainbow and began crafting tracks like Stargazer and Gates of Babylon, with full orchestras, choirs, and over-the-top theatrics, Page couldn't hide his disdain. Throwing violins at a problem doesn't make it music, he reportedly said at a party in 1977. And yet the irony was this. Both were fighting for the same thing. Both wanted the guitar to be the soul of the song. They just chose different paths. Page was a sorcerer, hidden behind layers of effects and shifting tempos. Blackmore was a stage knight, bold, direct, with no need for metaphors. But because of that, they could never intersect. They clashed simply by existing. And so for decades the feud smoldered, like a guitar string stretched too tightly, silent, yet always on the verge of snapping. No solo battles, no shouting matches, just distant glances, unnamed quotes, and precisely aimed jabs, all enough to prove one thing. Jimmy Page never considered Ritchie Blackmore a peer. Only a man muddying the waters, he believed, were meant to remain pure. And so the 6 names have been spoken, not in reverence, but as a warning. These are the ones who provoked the deepest disdain from a legend like Jimmy Page, not out of personal vendetta, but because they dared to violate what he holds sacred, music. Which name surprised you the most? Do you side with Jimmy Page, or do you think he was too harsh? Drop a comment below and tell us. Who is your greatest guitarist of all time? And who do you think never should have picked up a guitar in the first place? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to uncover more untold truths from the raw, electrifying world of rock.